Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the center. We're very pleased to be doing this webinar on Nina Lakhani's new book, Who Killed Berta Cáceres. It is a particularly important book coming at a critical moment. In 2015, Berta Cáceres was awarded one of the most prestigious environmental awards in the world, the Goldman Environmental Prize. It really reflected her extraordinary courage and achievement over a lifetime, struggling on a range of issues in Honduras. I wanted to briefly introduce her, but a book review which has just been posted on the Goldman Environmental Prize website. The first few sentences of that tightly describe who she was. And they're by Ryan Mack, a program officer with the Goldman Environmental Prize. He writes, Berta Cáceres was one of Latin America's foremost activists, championing indigenous rights, social justice, and environmental protection for decades. For Berta, these were never separate issues. Environmental, indigenous, and human rights were all interconnected. Her work encapsulated these values more than any other activist I have ever met. I was truly struck by that last tribute. A year after being awarded that great honor, she was murdered. And how and why that happened and its implications are covered in a particularly incisive, compelling, and rigorous way in Who Killed Berta Cáceres, Nina Lakhani's book. Our format today is going to be very straightforward. We're going to begin with Nina Lakhani, who will give a brief overview of the book, and then we will have two commentators. I will briefly introduce all three. Nina Lakhani has reported from over a dozen countries, including 6.5 years in Central America and Mexico. She is currently the environmental justice correspondent for The Guardian US, based in New York. Jo Berra is Human Rights in the Americas project director at the Promise Institute for Human Rights at the UCLA School of Law, as well as a professor there. He is a former Jesuit who has spent years working and living in Central America and was an international observer at the Cáceres trial. My friend and colleague, Rosemary Joyce, is chair of the Department of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. In 2011, she was appointed by President Obama to the Federal Cultural Property Advisory Committee. She has participated in field research in northern Honduras from 1977 to 2009. We have, I think, a rather exceptional group to begin this discussion. And then we have asked for questions when you registered from those who are participating in the webinar, and we will go to some of those questions after this initial opening. Before turning it over to Nina Lakhani, I just wanted to mention that we are welcoming as participants in this webinar people from Honduras, Peru, Brazil, Canada, Mexico, Spain, and London, as well as, of course, people in California and in the United States. So with that, I'm really honored to turn it over to Nina Lakhani.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Nina Lakhani. Thank you very much for coming to this webinar. So I am the author of this book. Thank you very much for organised this event to everyone. I thought I'd just quickly tell you a little bit about myself and how I ended up writing the book. I'm a Londoner. I'm from England. You can hear in my accent, I'm sure. I moved to Mexico City at the beginning of 2013 without much of a plan, really, but to just, tired of my job in London, and moved and ended up covering Mexico and Central America for almost 7 years, really focusing on Central America more than Mexico. I first went to Honduras at the end of 2013 when elections were being held, which were really the first so-called free and fair elections since the 2009 coup, which had toppled the democratically elected president. And so I went to cover those, and that was when I met and interviewed Berta Cáceres. It was the only time that I interviewed her. I met her, first of all, in downtown Tegucigalpa, the capital, when she was warning a delegation of observers and human rights, international human rights defenders, that the elections were not being held, were not free and fair. And because she and many other defenders, environmental defenders, activists, other sort of social groups were being terrorized. And that had been continuing since the coup. And actually, when I met her, she was on the lam. There was an arrest warrant out for her for trumped up charges brought by the dam company, which she was already leading a campaign with a local community, the Rio Blanco community, to try and stop construction of this dam. So she was sleeping in different places every night, but she invited me to go and interview her at her home in La Esperanza in the west of Honduras. I spent 1 hour with her at that interview, but boy, did it have an impact. She was serious, she was compelling, she was, I wouldn't call her fearless because she was scared, but she was clearly brave. For me, being brave is being scared and continuing anyway. 3 of her 4 children at the time were studying outside of the country because of the threats that were escalating in relation to the opposition to this dam, the Aguasarca Dam on the Gualcarque River. She told me that she missed being free. She missed her children, that she wanted to be able to swim in the river, to walk down the street, but that she was a human rights defender, following in the footsteps of her mother and her grandmother, and fighting for social justice, which, as already mentioned, which the Goldman Prize review very clearly states, Berta understood social justice, human rights, economic rights, gender rights, racial justice, all to be interlinked. They were never different. There were never things that she thought about separately. And she was just really compelling and convincing about the struggles that were happening in Honduras, and and specifically around the opposition to the dam. She said to me, at that time, look, no matter how many measures I take to protect myself, when they want to kill me, they will. My name is on a military hit list, and there is, I want to live. I have so much to live for. I love my country, and it doesn't have to be like this. But when they want to kill me, they will kill me. And unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, that's what happened. Less than a year after she won the Goldman Prize, at a time when she was probably the most celebrated, most well-known defender in the Americas, a group of poor young hitmen were hired as sicarios, as hitmen, to go to her house and shoot her dead inside her home. I remember clearly learning about her murder. I was on holiday at the time in Baja California and woke up to a whole load of missed calls from my editor at The Guardian, telling me, Berta's dead, Berta's been killed, they've killed her. And I just remember saying to my friends, if I can kill Berta Cáceres, I can kill anybody. And that's absolutely right. That the people who organized, who planned, who ordered and enabled her murder had such they felt so certain of the impunity, so sure that they could actually do anything that they wanted to, that they felt, able to actually order the murder of Berta Cáceres. I started reporting on her murder, really just as a freelance journalist for The Guardian. I started writing stories. I was there within a month and tried to initially just start to figure out what had happened in the last days and months of her life, and she was scared. In those last few months, she knew that something was going to happen. She was planning for it, but because she had always faced threats as leader of COPIN, her organization, and over the years, nobody really took her seriously. Nobody believed that those threats would actually end up with her being killed. But she knew her time was running out. I'm convinced of that. And as I started to write stories and I started to uncover, links and it to the armed forces, I wrote a story about how an army deserter who came to me had seen her name on a military hit list. He was worked in a special forces unit which received funded support, training and funding from the US, and how some of those that were initially arrested were military men, had the military as well as the dam company. The threats against me and the harassment against me really, started. And every time I published a story that sort of really hit a nerve, those threats, the trolls, the bots, the press releases, the sort of defamation would just be up to notch. And really from, quite quickly afterwards, I stopped traveling to Honduras by plane. I would always go in overland because Honduras has this inglorious record of stopping people at the airport, activists, defenders, journalists, and not allowing them in. So I sort of took quite long routes, different routes every time to get into the country. And I really just became convinced that this was a story that a lot of powerful people did not want to come out. They did not want the truth behind who killed Berta Cáceres. And when I say truth, I mean there are many levels of truth and many layers of sort of complexity in this. A lot of people, economic elites, military elites, the politicians had been in power since the coup, and parts of the US government did not want this story to come out. And I guess that's really what compelled me to turn the idea, that's sort of, I guess, where the seed of sort of turning this into a book was born. When I started really researching this story as a book, it became apparent really quickly that to understand why Berta was killed, you have to understand who she was and where she came from, and to understand who she was and why she was killed, you really have to understand the context in which she lived and died. And when I talk about context, I mean the political, the economic, the geopolitical, the military, the social sort of global context in which she lived and died. Without that, it's impossible to really even, try to understand why she was killed and why it's important, why we should care. Honduras, after the coup, became the most dangerous place in the world outside the war zone. It became the most dangerous place in the world to practice law, to be an environmental defender, to defend land, to be a woman. The violence just escalated, and impunity reigned. But why was it important for me? Why is it important? Why is Berta's story important? Because it was emblematic of so many other struggles for land, for justice that are happening in Honduras and across the region. Berta put so much energy and time into defending and opposing the Agua Zarca Dam because she understood that dam to be emblematic. Internationally funded so-called development project that was one of hundreds imposed in Honduras, in rural and indigenous communities without legally required consultations, through violent crackdowns that demonstrated that the economic elites that rule Honduras are able to call upon the state and all the forces of the state, courts, prosecutors, the military, police, local and state national politicians, in order to impose these projects with energy projects, mines, timber projects, cash crops, you know, which are internationally funded in many occasions, and cause huge amounts of environmental degradation, social conflict, and forced migration. These are things that Berta understood, you know, that this one dam was emblematic of what was happening all across Honduras and also the rest of Central America. So I think her story, her life, and her assassination are absolutely emblematic of the region more generally, and really, you know, I'll just finish by saying that, and really emblematic of how the international community and international investors continue to enable and fund the sort of the extractive economic model, which is responsible for huge amounts of like environmental damage and economic inequalities and social injustice and forced migration from Central America to the US and beyond. The international community has not shown any willingness to really hold itself to account, never mind Honduras, and it's continued. So, you know, my book is by no means a it probably raises more questions than it answers. But what I've tried to do is really just, you know, use Berta's story as an arc to really open the door to what is an incredibly complex country in an incredibly complex and diverse region, where the US is omnipresent in so many ways, and where the international community have many questions to answer.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Joe Berra.
Let's see if I get unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Well, thank you, Harley. And thank you, Nina, for this amazing book and for sharing your story with us today. I'm going to be reading from some notes, so please excuse my lack of virtual eye contact in this. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this virtual event is taking place in part on the lands of Ohlone people, where the University of California, Berkeley is located. And I speak to you as a guest on the lands of the Tongva. Both UC Berkeley and UCLA are land-grant institutions, beneficiaries of the Morrill Act of 1862, meaning that our higher education system was built with the rents and proceeds from land stolen from native peoples across the Western United States. We acknowledge the Ohlone, the Tongva, as well as the indigenous peoples of Honduras, the Lenca, Maya Chorti, Garifuna Pech, Tawaka, Miskitu. And we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging, of the first peoples of all of Turtle Island and Abya-Yala, from which many of you are listening. Nina opens her book with a simple statement: you can't kill the truth. Let me say, Nina, you have done a great service to the truth with your meticulous investigative reporting come to fruition here. The emerging right to the truth is gaining normative capital in the international human rights framework. It is the center of the Black Lives Matter movement. It is at the center of that movement with its demands to bring to light not just the facts around the murders of so many Black women and men at the hands of police brutality, but to make us aware of the long history of appropriation of Black bodies, racial injustice, and structures of racism embedded in our laws and institutions. It is at the heart of our struggles here in the United States over monuments and memorialization. It is a demand not only of the individual victim of human rights violations, but of society itself, as a necessary step to ensure integral justice and guarantee the no repetition of these crimes, particularly crimes of the state. It is a self-standing right because of the way truth is masked by structures of power and impunity. Today, more than ever, it is this societal right that journalists defend. And because of this, they are deemed enemies of the state. I know personally many of, or most of the actors in the story as told by Nina, and I know intimately the story itself. Yet I'm also frustrated trying to explain both the complex web of social, political, economic, and international relations that explain Honduras, and the clear patterns, on the other hand, that are produced by that web. As Victor Fernandez, the attorney for the family, says about the Agua Zarca case, you pull one thread and it unravels the whole network of the cancer infecting Honduras. The real challenge is, once unraveling that thread, weaving together a coherent narrative that can seize and awaken the consciousness of both the casual and sophisticated reader. And Nina has done that here. Nina has also done justice to what the family of Berta Cáceres, Copin, and those working on the case refer to as the cause of Berta Cáceres. There are, in fact, multiple legal cases related to the assassination, one going on in Holland against the development bank FMO that was involved in financing the case. There's a large corruption case going on in Honduras against those who facilitated the concession through illegal corrupt means. And of course, there's the assassination case. And the court case of bringing to justice both the material and intellectual authors of the crime is of supreme importance. However, for the family and for Copin and the lawyers themselves, what is most important is that the case served to promote rather than distract from the broader cause of Berta Cáceres. The broader cause is all the things Nina talks about in her book and talked about just now. The struggle for rights to territory and self-determination of the Lenca people and other indigenous peoples. The struggle of the social movement against corruption and neoliberal extractivism. The struggle to protect the environment, the struggle against structural impunity. If you attach yourself to the cause of Berta Cáceres, then you necessarily enter, to some degree, that same unsafe space that Berta occupied and that her family members, her lawyers, and the members of the Honduran social movement continue to occupy today. And as Nina noted, she knows firsthand what that means. I was going to talk a little bit about the International Observer mission I was a part of and had some other comments on the book, but I'll try to keep them limited so we can get to the next presentation and also to questions. I will say that as international observers, as part of this mission, we were constrained in some sense by our technical mission, and our report is necessarily dry and technical in many respects. However, we were aware that the broader cause, we were aware of this broader cause and we aligned our work with it. Some, like myself, have worked with Copin on other issues like territorial rights of the Rio Blanco community and the right of indigenous peoples to consultation. I'd like to comment on a few things as I close my presentation here. One is that we are at a moment that Nina describes a number of times in the book of deeds done under the cover of night. In the book, she talks about passing expansive laws, facilitating concessions of vast natural resources, and protecting business interests being passed after midnight in the legislature with little public debate or scrutiny. Well, now, in a sense, Honduras lies under a cloak of darkness again, in part due to the COVID crisis and the limited access to information due to the partial shutdown. So we have to be vigilant. The system may accede, for example, to Sergio Rodriguez's request to be released to house arrest, Sergio Rodriguez being one of those material authors who have already been charged and punished for the crime of the assassination of Berta, requesting to leave to be released to house arrest due to the danger proposed by COVID in the prison. This gets back to Nina's comments in her book about the selective use of the laws in favor of those who have the most powerful interests. So far, he has not been released, though. Or whether, for example, the appeals and delay tactics of the legal team of David Castillo, the one intellectual author that has been charged with the crime, will undermine the case against him. Or whether the appeals of Rodriguez and Mariano Diaz, another the intelligence officer, the active military intelligence officer who was also convicted of the crime, whether they'll be granted at some point, those appeals on some technicality, or whether the Gualcarque fraud case will die at some point based on the lobbying efforts of the company DESA and the weakening of the prosecutorial unit that's charged with the prosecution of crimes of corruption. And whether the demand to continue to pursue the intellectual authors of the crime itself will die down. So there's clearly an interest in the Honduran political and judicial system to claim a victory with the initial convictions of 7 individuals while never getting at the intellectual authors of the crime. And we as an international community need to be vigilant in continuing the pressure to get at an integral justice in this case. And this event and Nina's book helps keep it in the public light. So I think I'll end there. I was going to, I had some further comments on the connections that Nina draws out in her book with international financial institutions and the project itself, but that may come up in the questions, as well as the further work that we did in our International Observer mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And now we'll conclude with Rosemary Joyce.
Thank you very much. I want to echo Joe's comments that the book serves an important purpose in not only showing us how a crime of this magnitude could be committed against somebody whose international visibility should have made her in some sense protected, but also draw out a few threads of the connection between the centrality of resource exploitation behind the 2009 coup and behind the murder of Berta Cáceres to the history of de-emphasizing indigenous presence in Honduras and taking a position that argues that many of Honduras' descendants of indigenous people should not be considered authentic participants in decision-making on their own part. And these two things are so tightly imbricated together that when we look at the history of this particular tragedy and outrage, they can't be separated apart. And it's one of the real contributions of this book that it makes it possible for us to see how important indigenous sovereignty and indigenous rights are to the fight against environmental exploitation. One of the striking things about the 2009 coup was the centrality for the Congress that illegally took over Honduras of the mission to grant economic contracts to a small set of families and cronies. 6 bills approved contracts for infrastructure projects on the very same Sunday that Congress met illegally to throw the legally elected president out of the country. The only work that Congress did, other than declare that Zelaya was no longer president, was to authorize infrastructure projects and transfer funds to specific towns in the country to fund these kinds of projects. And in fact, in the month that followed, Congress passed almost no laws other than contracts of that sort for hydroelectric projects, mining projects, dams, and the like. That alone should tell us that the exploitation of the environment is central to the kind of authoritarian regimes that have followed in Honduras and that continue to be in charge of Honduras during its current crisis with COVID-19. In order to then contest these kinds of development projects, which are primarily benefiting a small national elite, land defenders like Berta Cáceres and the many others who have died since and who continue to be at risk in Honduras have based their arguments firmly on indigenous rights to a voice in the treatment of Honduran land and on Honduran resources. And in those struggles, they continually face challenges to their authentic identity as indigenous descendants. And this again is covered in the narrative of the trial, which recounts the extraordinary attempts by defense attorneys to question the Lenca identity of Berta. This is not unique to this trial, and it's something that's worth underlining, that Honduran society has a kind of love-hate relationship with indigeneity. On the one hand, claiming identity from Maya descent represented in the World Heritage Site of Copan, but at the same time saying that the Maya are gone today and that what remains is a appropriable heritage of the mestizo or mixed community. On the one hand, officially acknowledging that Honduras is a multicultural society with 9 indigenous groups, and on the other hand, questioning the legitimacy of the North Coast Garifuna people and their right to be in control of the development of their traditional territory on the grounds that they were not in that territory, or their ancestors were not in that territory since time immemorial. In those kinds of struggles, international experts need to be voices to support the arguments made by indigenous land defenders. And people in my own discipline of anthropology need to be self-conscious of the ways that anthropological perspectives can be used against indigenous people if we emphasize discontinuity or make calls for certain kinds of performances of authenticity, such as the continued childhood use of indigenous languages, so that we anthropologists stop saying things like the last Lenca speaker died in the 1970s, which then can be easily translated into saying that people today who are Lenca are not truly inheritors of that identity. So we need to think about authenticity beyond continuity. We need to bring to this the concept of survivance from Native American and Indigenous studies, which is the reframing of the work that was done throughout the 500 years of the colonial period by Indigenous Honduran people to ensure their survivance. And part of that historical work included translation, included learning the culture of the colonizing society, learning the language, learning the legal system. And when that is turned against Indigenous people as evidence of their lack of indigeneity, then we are complicit in injustice. There's a specific Lenca version of this which comes up in the book, and that's the Lenca regard for the earth expressed in the ceremonies of compostura, ceremonies through which Lenca people historically, as attested in colonial documents, before and as attested in the material residues of Lenca action that were accumulated before the Spanish observers arrived, through compostura, Lenca people in history tell us that they are caring for, guarding, and reproducing the health of the earth. So this position as an indigenous land defender is one that is a continuation of a historic position of Lenca people. And the book does an extraordinary job of showing how that is a fully contemporary and fully indigenous position at the same time. And I'd like to end with, by echoing Joe's acknowledgement that I am speaking from land that is the unceded territory of Huichin, ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. And I'd like to thank all three presenters for really superb presentations and putting some very tough and critical issues on the table. We received a number of questions from participants in the webinar today when they registered. Some of those questions were very general and broad. Some were quite specific about the case and Berta Cáceres. So I'm going to try to alternate between them, and I'd ask our responders to try to be brief. And we will start with Nina, and then Rosemary or Joe, if you would like to comment on each of these questions, please do so. The first question is more broad. How can we build coalitions between indigenous communities on borderlands between Central American countries?
So how can we build coalitions between, I missed the last bit, sorry, between...
Sure. I can repeat it. How can we build coalitions between indigenous communities on borderlands between Central American?
Oh, okay. Well, I think indigenous communities are building their own coalitions. I don't think we need to do that. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think that they are, you know, one of the things that Berta was absolute, you know, what made her was just this, you know, insatiable thirst to learn from other native communities, not just in Central America and Latin America, but beyond, you know, and to learn from them. And that enabled her to understand and explain what was happening in her corner of Western Honduras in a regional and global context, you know, and so those coalitions, physically, you know, and sort of more, I guess, you know, intellectually and politically exist and are constantly evolving and being, you know, and moving forward, you know, and certainly in the case of Honduras, Berta had, you know, and her organization COPIN had excellent relationships with indigenous organizations and other rural organizations across Mesoamerica. You know, they were involved in coalitions, in networks, and they learned from each other. For example, it was Guatemala that really, the mining sort of, you know, the unrolling of the mining nightmare started in Guatemala first, really, and you know, the Guatemalan indigenous communities that were sort of, you know, who had those projects imposed on them and resisted and fought against those projects, were very much involved in teaching other communities, native communities and rural communities in El Salvador, Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, you know. So those coalitions exist. We as sort of from here don't need to be doing that. I mean, I think we can facilitate things in terms of resources. You know, I think that actually resources that people can meet more often, that they can, you know, produce materials together, that they can, you know, that sort of thing. But yeah, those coalitions have always existed, and they continue to evolve. And Rosemary probably has more knowledge about that than me, but that's my experience.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, Rosemary, were you going to comment? I was going to make
go ahead.
A brief comment. Agree with everything Nina said. If we can be in solidarity with them, the indigenous peoples who are doing that on their own. And just as an example, in the case, in the trial itself, the lawyers tried to submit an expert testimony and an expert report that the team had recruited an indigenous organization in Guatemala to prepare. The Bufete Indígena Popular, the Indigenous Popular Law Office, an indigenous-run law office that put together with their own indigenous experts a report on the social context in which the assassination occurred. And that was rejected by the court as not relevant to determining the guilt or innocence of those who were accused, but it was also an example of both the legal system's incapacity of seeking out the truth in the case and a broader understanding of the context, and probably exemplified kind of ethnic bias and discrimination against this particular expert opinion that was being presented by indigenous intellectuals from Guatemala.
Yeah. I would briefly, Harley, just to say that everything Nina has said needs to be taken into account. I'd also question who the we is, what we should be doing. If the we is non-Indigenous people or scholars, then what we should be doing is learning what Indigenous networks already exist, learning from them, finding the documents that they are already producing, and not trying to insert ourselves necessarily in situations before we understand the local and the complexity of the local.
Thank you. The next question is quite specific, and while we don't identify the questioners, this is someone who had a close personal relation with Berta Cáceres. What is the state of the Honduran government with SDNY and the DEA investigation into Hernandez's role as an alleged drug trafficker?
Well, you know as much as I do, I guess. I mean, we know that the current president has been named. The current president and his predecessor have been named as co-conspirators in a drug trafficking network by the Southern District of New York prosecutors in a trial involving the current president's brother, who was found guilty of drugs and arms trafficking and money laundering. We know that. We also know that the day after that he was named as a co-conspirator, the acting US ambassador for Honduras appeared in a public event with him in Tegucigalpa. So no pasa nada, nothing happens in Honduras, not at the moment anyway. So, I mean, I think that and I'm only really saying this based on the public knowledge, I don't have any inside knowledge of this, that there is an investigation, there is evidence, and clearly many people, a number of people who are involved in that network, Hondurans, Guatemalans, and other nationalities, have information that is likely implicate the president. But we're in a situation politically here in the US where the current government has shown an absolute blind support for Juan Orlando Hernandez. The only policy that the current government seems to have when it comes to Honduras and the rest of Central America is keep your people away from our border. That's the only policy, and they're willing to tolerate absolutely anything else. So, Pompeo recently announced that to help Honduras, the Honduran government come out of the pandemic and the economic downturn, they were going to provide aid for businesses and for security. There is, the interest and the commitment to justice at a government level has absolutely diminished hugely under the Trump administration. So I think my guess would be, and it really is no more than that, is that there needs to be a change of government in the US. before there's really any chance of Juan Orlando Hernandez being indicted. That would be my guess, but really it's no more than that.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that?
Maybe briefly. I was asked a similar question by some of my friends in Honduras when the U.S. attorney was fired by Barr, effectively by Trump, and concerned about what would happen with the ongoing investigations. And that maneuver was clearly one that was punishing the U.S. attorney of that office for getting too close to the interests of Donald Trump and his cronies. And it's not unlike what has happened in Honduras. And I would love to bring out greater comparisons between Honduras state and the US state, because a lot of them are there. But it's not unlike when the anti-corruption prosecuting office, with the support that they had from the OAS support group, has been weakened because they were getting too close to those who are actually sitting in power. I do think that because that move was made against the prosecutor because he had gotten too close to direct personal interests of Trump, that it didn't have anything to do with the Honduran investigations. However, I'm a little bit skeptical, just as a part of general U.S. policy, that the Southern District of New York is actually going to indict a sitting president. I think even before Trump, that was probably, again, this is a bit my own speculation, but I don't know that it has ever occurred where one of these investigations, even where high government officials in another country are clearly implicated, they are going after other officials to send a message to those high-level officials that we know you're behind this, and we're getting closer to your circle, and it's kind of a warning sign. But whether there will actually be, I doubt whether a sitting president will be indicted, and the fact that Porfirio Lobos, the ex-president, has not yet been indicted is also a sign that maybe even that person is somewhat protected on our system, because it may be seen as too political to actually do that.
Can I just add one thing, if you don't mind? We both, Joe and I both mentioned the current administration. The Honduran regime has been in power and since 2009. This isn't just about the Trump administration. This crosses various governments, and multiple governments, and so all of the things that we're discussing in terms of the rollout of environmentally destructive projects without consultation, the violent crackdown, the impunity and corruption, all of that the coup was a before and after in this, and so things have got massively worse under Trump, yes, absolutely, but this didn't begin with him by any means, and the political party, well, I would call it a criminal organization masquerading as a political party, has been now in power for 11 years, and yeah, we can't blame Trump for all of that.
If I can follow up on that, I think it's really important to underline that U.S. policy towards Honduras for a very long time has been less about what's good for Honduras and more about addressing whatever the current security concern is. So people crossing the border have that concern about Hondurans entering the U.S. started before the current administration. The current administration is much, much more violent towards those people, but the idea that was a flood and a danger predates that. And most importantly, the idea that what's important in Honduras is to have a vigorous security state has been a long-standing U.S. position that under pins authoritarian governments there, and that has directly led to the training and the outfitting of many of the people who go on to commit these kinds of violent crimes. We want to see the drug indictments continue in SDNY, but we need the US to change its policy towards Central America from one that is primarily concerned about keeping foreigners out and stemming the tide of drugs to one that acknowledges that there's dependencies that were created by colonial and neo-colonial histories, and that does something significant for that.
I'm going to add one more thing. I'm sorry. Just to say, you know, I think that Central America generally and Honduras really particularly has for many, many decades been treated as a laboratory by the US in all senses of the word, you know, for military operations, for economic development projects, for social control, for all sorts of things, you know, and I know that, you know, it's probably sort of a phrase that's used a bit too much, you know, but I absolutely think that that's what, you know, even when you go back to Honduras' sort of original title of the Banana Republic, you know, the sort of imposition of mega cash crops on fertile land to benefit the economic interests of a few, you know, few multinationals. That started in Honduras in the region, you know, and I think and that continues, you know, the sort of crops have changed, or the sort of the market has changed, you know, but I think Honduras has very much always been a laboratory, and the fact that the US has used it as a military satellite since 1954, you know, says a lot. That's it. No, I'll stop now, sorry.
Thank you. And I will, unfortunately, we are just beginning the discussion and we are about out of time. I will conclude with one final question and mention we would invite people to check the website of the Center for Latin American Studies, clas.berkeley.edu, and we may be able to continue some of the discussion on Honduras that has been so thoughtful and I think important tonight. So the final question, and I'd ask that people keep their answers brief, is what role has the government of Mexico played in events in Honduras today?
Sorry. I mean, Mexico, I lived in Mexico for quite a long time, you know, and Mexico and Mexicans, generally speaking, are always looking northward, you know, rather than looking south. I mean, you know, I've met very few Mexicans that have even been to Central America, or, you know, would even consider Central America as somewhere that they'd want to go. You know, I think there's been very, very few, if any, policies in Mexico, you know, that specifically relate to Central America. The exceptions to that are during the civil wars. You know, Mexico gave refuge absolutely to many refugees from Guatemala, Chile, and other countries, you know, as well. And you know, but really, I mean, it has obviously economic ties. That there are trade deals, which I think Central American farmers would absolutely say favor Mexico as a bigger economy, you know, in the same way Mexican farmers think, you know, that NAFTA favors the US and Canada. And really in the last, certainly since my time there over the last, you know, decade or so, it's all been about immigration. But Mexico has no immigration policy when it comes to Central Americans. What it does is that Central American migrants are used as a pawn, you know, in discussions with the US. So when the US threatens to, you know, when the US puts pressure on Mexico, migrants are often used as the bargaining chip. You know, there is no cohesive policy, but from, you know, in Mexico towards Central American migration. It's really dictated by the whims and the sort of desires of the US, you know. And so, but obviously in recent years, it's been massively destructive, you know. Hundreds of thousands of Central Americans, more than that, have been detained by Mexican military and immigration officers and deported without due process. It's one of the most dangerous migration passages in the world today. Migrants are kidnapped, abducted, disappeared, raped, assaulted with almost total impunity, and often, with complicity by state actors. So Mexico, while it has really, it prides itself in its history of opening its doors to refugees, its recent history with Central American migrants, and also migrants from other countries, is something that they should be ashamed of.
Would anyone else like to briefly comment?
Briefly, similar to 2009, in 2017, the elections of 2017, where Juan Orlando Hernandez was reelected, their legitimacy was questioned. The OAS saw serious problems with fraud, indicia of fraud, and were calling for new elections. The US, again, pretty much mobilized to protect the result, the ultimate result that the election council declared Juan Orlando Hernandez the winner. And that the US was able to do after first persuading Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia to come out and recognize the results from pressure of the US, so that it wouldn't look like the US was the one legitimizing the electoral result. They later came on board saying, well, the other countries around Honduras, the other Latin American countries, are beginning to recognize, and so we're just going to follow the flow, when in fact it was the US that pressured them to come out first.
I'd forgotten that, Joe. I'm glad you brought that up. I'd forgotten.
Any other comments? Then I'd like to thank our presenters once again, all our participants for being here, and end by simply saying, if you haven't read it or gotten it, I would highly recommend Nina Lakhani's book, Who Killed Berta Cáceres. I will look forward to seeing you in future webinars by the Center for Latin American Studies. Thank you.